In this video, I'm revisiting some quartz fabrication details that I left out of my previous quartz fabrication video, and now I get to stop saying quartz fabrication. This is going to be discussing some templating and show you how to cut holes for sinks and other things. And while this will be specific to quartz, you can use most of the same techniques for just about any kind of countertop. The default material for templating quartz is corrugated plastic. While it is available at the usual renovation stores, call around to some plastic suppliers. You'll very likely be able to get it for less than half the cost, but you'll also be able to get it in the proper size of 5 foot by 10 foot. Most retail places only have 4 by 8, which can work, but might make it that you have to add seams in your templates to span a full countertop. Cutting the template to fit your space is pretty easy. Just remember to add some extra on any exposed edges, especially the front. I use a 2-inch overhang on the front of all of my cabinets, but you can use any amount you want, providing your material supports it or has support. My kitchen island has a 13-inch, unsupported, eating area overhang. I used a 1.5-inch overhang on any sides that weren't against the wall. You're going to want to scribe your template to fit any walls you have fairly closely. It could be said that fitting the back is less important because you'll have some backsplash or tiles to cover any gaps. But since you do need to scribe the inside corners, as they're always a little funky and rounded, and they determine your counter's placement, as well as any sides, since they're going to be visible from the front, you might as well go ahead and scribe the back too. With your template cut out, be sure to label it. I'm not a full-time professional in the industry quartz fabricator, darn it, I had to say it again, but I use the following marks. An E to mark an edge that will need polishing, a line with a cent side beside it to show the center of any sinks you might have, arrows to point towards where walls are, and the name of the room and area the piece will go into. Use a factory edge for the front of your template and line that up against the factory edge of your quartz. If you have an exposed side or two, try to use at least one factory edge for your template there as well. Tape your template down before you start tracing, as this kind of hard plastic on quartz can like to move. Use pencil to mark the quartz, not Sharpie. Use a Sharpie to mark the template, not pencil. You don't have to, but something a lot of people like, especially for bathroom vanities, is to use 4 to 6 inches of the same quartz material to form the backsplash, and any side splashes you might have. If you're going to do that and your material has patterns like mine does, instead of the chipped glass static noise that some quartz has, then you'll want to pay close attention to how you plan your cuts. Here's a little render that I spent way too much time making, so I hope you like it. Basically, it shows how you make your cuts if you want to maintain your pattern throughout the different pieces. It'll end up looking like my downstairs bathroom vanity here. Now that we're done templating, we can move to cutting out sinks. Make sure you get a catalog from your quartz fabrication tool supplier and spend a lot of time going through it. It's unlikely the sales reps will give you complete advice. I originally got this 1.25-inch hole saw that also had some burrs on the sides, hoping it would do double duty as both the hole saw for all my faucets and also as the inside corner saw for all my sinks. You can see in my laundry room, along with the custom sink I made for it, I used this hole saw in the corners. Unfortunately, polishing these corners was not easy. Due to how incredibly soft quartz is, the pads that I described in my previous quartz fabrication video ended up reshaping the corners as much as they were polishing them. So before I did the other sinks, I spent some more time in the catalog and found these 2 polishing drums and was able to pair that with a tile saw. With the hole saw and the polishing drums both being 2-inch diameter, I could avoid using the polishing discs until the final grit. With the tools gathered, here's what I did to cut out my sinks. I don't have the most practice or steady hand, and since you don't use a pilot drill when working on quartz, I opted for the safer method of using a corner guide. This was nothing special, just something I could clamp to the corner and push the hole saw against to make sure it wouldn't wander outside the sink area. If it wandered inside, I didn't care because that would all get cut out. I also started by only dry scoring deep enough that I could be sure it wouldn't wander, and then came back with water to finish the cuts. Cut your 4 holes first and then cut the sides after. This lets you creep up on the exact position of the hole and not overshoot due to the curve of the blade. Position your slab so that the sink cutout has total support through at least one middle axis. You want the full weight of the cutout to be supported when finishing your last cut. I went so far as to have a scrap of MDF underneath all the parts of the sink that I wasn't actively cutting. Polishing the edges inside a sink is the same as polishing outside edges, so I'll just focus on a few points about the corners. Get it? Points? Corners? Come on, man! Anyway, the way I had to do it was to channel my inner Vancouver carpenter and really feather my edges. I couldn't come up with a good way to make any graphics on the computer, so we got out the pencil and some paper and I sketched it out. We're going to imagine that this is my hole saw and that these lines that I hope are going to show up on the video are the corners of my sink. If you take your hole saw and you line it up exactly with the edges of your sink, you might think that that's going to get you a perfect lineup, but what happens is when you start to grind away to do your polishing, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but you end up grinding out past the sides of your sink. And so that's what I mean when I say you need to feather your edges, because you end up with this extra bulge out the corner, and you've got to make that look a little bit less apparent by bringing that out into the sides. What I would do in the future instead is start my hole saw a little bit away from the edges of the sink here. And that way, when I go in with the grinding drums, with the polishing drums to grind it away a little bit more, I can get it to end up in exactly the place where I want it to be. I didn't consider this to be any sort of real problem, and it doesn't look bad on any of the finished sinks. It's just something that I noticed that I'd do differently in the future. I spoke a little before about how much overlap to leave on the fronts and sides of a countertop, but I left out how much to leave on the inside of the sink because most sinks will come with a template for cutting. If your sink didn't come with a template, you can go with 1/8 to 1/4 inch on any vertical walled sinks, like a kitchen or wet bar, and up to 1/2 inch on sloped sinks and vanities. You can also always cut a test piece out of some cardboard to check how your sink will look in whatever size hole you plan to cut.